before I get into my presentation, let me begin with a couple of preliminary remarks. First, I understand this is your last class, is this correct?
Yes.
Okay, well, I will try to make it fun, informative, and somewhat interactive. And I will try to keep it as brief as I can. If it starts getting tedious, you can start giving me some signs, and I will respect your time. But let me also just start with a quick poll, and don't respond if you're not comfortable doing this, but I just like a sense of who I'm talking to in terms of outlook, or what I call worldview. How many of you would call yourselves religious? If you wouldn't mind just raising your hand. Okay. And how many of you might define yourself as spiritual but not religious? Okay. And would any of you classify yourself as an agnostic or atheist? All right, well, we've got a pretty good mix of people here. That's great. Well, I call myself an atheist, an agnostic, and someone who knows that God is real. Before you head for the exits, there is some method to this madness, which I will try to explain as we go along. But let me give you the brief summary of how I find it possible to make those three claims about myself. First of all, I am an atheist about the claims traditionally made about God. And I'll have more to say about that as we go along. But secondly, I am genuinely an agnostic about whether there was a creator of the universe that we inhabit. And finally, I know that God is real and in the world as a very powerful concept in people's minds. And that might sound trivial, but I will bet a $10 bill, if only I had one, that God is at least as real as money, because money is nothing more than a powerful concept in our minds that we occasionally put down in paper or metal form. But really the medium of it is not what holds its value. It's the belief that people have about money that gives it its value. Similarly, if nothing more, God is certainly real in that sense. Now, I want to add that I'm not here to tell you in the course of this discussion what you should believe. You have the right to believe anything whatsoever. I'm here, though, to try to see if faith and reason can intersect, and if we can use the evidence that we've amassed through human activity, particularly through the activity we call science, to narrow some of the possibilities within what I might call rational faith. Now, that isn't the only kind of faith there is, and there's not necessarily anything more respectable about it. It depends on your frame of reference. But it's certainly where I come from. I'm a rationalist, and I want to figure out as best I can what the world really is. So let me, with that, move on and give you a sense of my tasks for the evening. I'm going to try to do 4 big things in as little time as possible without making your head spin. I'm going to share my view of the struggle between what I call old-time religion and what I call faith. And then I'm going to ask whether God exists, and immediately yank that question off the table and go on to ask if traditional theism is justified. And after that, I'll look at some alternative worldviews. And finally, consider what principles might unite people of good faith. So, let's get underway. This is an illustration from a creationist publication. And if you're in the back and can't read it, it says, "Meanwhile, Jesus and Darwin were fighting again." And I'll leave it to you to sort out who's who. But this sort of illustrates that for many people, what are generally known as the culture wars are actual battles. Sometimes they're fought with bullets, sometimes they're fought with ballots, but to many people they're matters of life and death. And it's not only religious people. Many atheists believe religion or humanity, one of us has to go. One of us has to go. The most popular piece I ever wrote for the Huffington Post was a few years ago when I wrote about how some eschatological fundamentalists, people who believe the end is near, and some scientists agree on one thing: the end is near. They believe that for very different reasons, but their conclusion is much the same. Quite a few atheists and a number of theistic scientists as well fear that we are heading for global catastrophe. And this is a projection of a path to human extinction over the next to 10 centuries. But things get bad fast in this scenario. I share their concerns about the future. I think there are many grave global dangers just ahead for us. But I'm not ready to despair. Does anyone remember the quotations that appeared on your course syllabus for this class? Did they make a deep impression on you? That was probably many miles ago. There's one who knows. Well, the first of them was a quotation from 1 Timothy that says, "Fight the good fight of faith." And I want you to know that's really what I'm all about. Although, as you'll see, it's, from my point of view, outside any traditional religion. The way that I see things is that we're engaged in a fateful clash between adherents of old-time religion and people of good faith. Now, I've had a number of people, roughly my age, bristle at my use of old-time religion because to them it connotes something nostalgic and warm in the Midwest and South in a particular Protestant vein. But that's not at all what I mean. What I mean by old-time religion is those large, powerful religious forces in the world that are fighting for God's victory on earth. And they include the Vatican, they include the Salafi Sunni Muslims, they include the Shiite Ayatollahs, they even include the new apostolics here in America. What they all have in common is they believe they are carrying the banner for God and that sooner or later they are going to make way for God's victory through their particular channel of belief. No major religion is exempt from this, and no major religion has engaged in this kind of thinking without also engaging in violence. The noted religious scholar Philip Jenkins of Penn State University says, "Religion in the 21st century has become the prime animating and destructive force in human affairs." But what is religion? I don't know if you've chewed on that question in this class already or not. I have pondered it for more than a decade, and I've gone to many different sources for definitions of religion, and I have not been satisfied with any of them. So eventually, working with others who were interested in the subject, I came up with my own definition. And this is what I use in my book and what I mean by religion in the context of this talk. Religion is an organized cultural response to shared beliefs about ultimate reality. Organized is highlighted there because it's not enough to just have a cultural response. I mean, we could all get together and sing a hymn, but that wouldn't by itself make a religion. It might be somewhat organized, but not organized enough. Religion arises when those shared beliefs about ultimate reality motivate people to create practices, to create rituals, to create institutions, to separate some things from other things in what the founder of the study of religion called the sacred and the profane. All of those things, I think, amount to religion. Whether we're talking about 30,000 years ago, or we're talking about shamanism of the last few centuries, or the massive organized religious institutions of today. It's all, I think, reducible to something like this. Now, old-time religion is a subset of that. Not every religion amounts to what I call old-time religion. Old-time religion has a number of characteristics. Whatever the creed, whatever the denomination, whatever the brand, if you will, old-time religion is characterized by being dogmatic. It's not open to debate if you're within the group. It's also characterized by hostility to science. Einstein may have come up with the formula E equals mc squared, but in the eyes of old-time religion, science equals evil. Old-time religion demands obedience. It's something that you have to trust and obey. You don't get to question the ways of the Lord. I'm sorry. This is a tricky situation. Old-time religion is authoritarian. If you happen to be a Roman Catholic, if you're a layperson, you don't get to vote for who is Pope, and you don't get to question the decrees of the Vatican. It's authoritarian. You cannot argue with the dictates of old-time religion, because old-time religion claims that it's speaking on behalf of God. And that leads to another characteristic of old-time religion. It's doctrinaire. It's characterized by a set of rules. They're written down in a document or a book, and your job as a member of the faithful is to study it and learn it by heart. Not to change it, not to question it, not to interpret it. Although interpret it, people certainly do. Now, if that were all, maybe we'd be content to say, well, you live your way, I'll live mine. But unfortunately, old-time religion is out to conquer. It insists on taking what it sees as its rightful place in the world, which is ruling over everything. And this is not just one religion. We're all most familiar with the ambitions of jihadi Islam, because they've impressed themselves on the world over the last decade in terrible but unforgettable ways. But they are far from the only religion that has those kinds of aspirations. Here in America, the Seven Mountains movement aspires to take over every major institution in America, from Hollywood to the White House. They're just one of the branches of what are called Reconstructionist Christians, who imagine that they will remake American society in the vision of primarily the Old Testament. The New Apostolic Reformation is another one. They've become deeply entrenched in some elements of politics. Whatever they call themselves, these tendencies among the Reconstructionists, in my view, amount to the American Taliban. If you look at what they advocate, it's really quite similar. Very restrictive society with the death penalty for just about everything except avoiding taxes. I'm not quite sure why they're so tolerant of tax evasion, except that they don't like the government that they don't rule. And finally, it follows from that old-time religion is often violent. This is a scene from a recent clash in Nigeria between Boko Haram, a jihadi Islamic group there, and Nigerian Christians. Many, many people have died in those clashes. It's a horrible situation. And again, I would not for a moment minimize the senseless violence that Islamists have inflicted on people around the world. But it's important to remember that it's not Islam alone that has violent tendencies. I worked in Tokyo for close to a decade and narrowly missed being there when a Buddhist offshoot group injured 5,000 people on the Tokyo subway and killed half a dozen by releasing poison gas for some utterly incomprehensible end. They just followed their leader, who told them to develop this poison gas and then release it at risk to their own lives down in the subway. And of course, here in the U.S., we've had mostly small scale, but nevertheless quite terrible incidents of religiously inspired terrorism. Do you all remember? Some of you are too young to remember the Atlanta Olympics, where Eric Rudolph set off a bomb, somehow connecting that with an anti-abortion protest in his mind. Difficult to see what the Olympics has to do with an issue that rightfully belongs in public policy arena. More recently, Scott Roeder murdered Dr. George Tiller in church just a few hundred miles south of here in Kansas. He thought he was carrying out God's will. Old-time religion is aggressive and often violent, but it does have its funny side, and thank goodness for that. Unfortunately, the funny side of old-time religion tends to arise out of the fact that it's also quite superstitious. And you have probably heard of many incidents where people think that miraculously the face of Jesus or the face of the Virgin Mary has appeared on anything from toast to a frying pan to anything else, and they immediately get on eBay, and somebody even wackier than them bids it up to an extraordinary price. Well, that's old-time religion as I see it. But what about faith? In our culture, at least, faith and religion are often used interchangeably. This might be because of the profession that I used to work in many years ago, the newspapers, where anytime that you can substitute a shorter word for a longer word in a headline, it makes life easier. But faith truly is not the same as religion. If we bear in mind that religion, as I said, is an organized cultural response, we'll soon see how much faith varies from that. But defining faith is perhaps as difficult or more difficult than defining religion itself. It varies so much. Faith can be poetic, it can be religious, it can be secular, it can be personal, or it can be abstract, and of course it can be inspiring. Let me share a few quick examples with you. The Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, born in the 19th century, wrote that faith is the bird that sings before dawn. I think that's a lovely poetic characterization of faith, and it somehow resonates with my idea and perhaps with yours as well of what faith is. And then a filmmaker in South Africa said, faith is like potatoes. I'm not quite sure what they had in mind there, but clearly faith to them means something different from religion. If they had titled their movie Religion Like Potatoes, it probably would have been picketed. Faith can certainly be religious, and it can certainly be inspirational, as those of us who were around in the 60s can remember from the Civil Rights Movement. But faith can be purely secular, even commercial. It's not really a stretch to use faith in this context. We have faith in our product, so we offer 100% customer satisfaction guarantee. Nothing wrong with that, right? If they said, we have religion in our product, you might question what they're talking about. Faith can also be quite personal. If a woman comes to bat in the bottom of the last inning with a runner on second and her husband yells out, "I have faith in you, honey," he's not presuming that she's the goddess of SWAT. He's expressing a personal conviction that come what may, she'll do her best and it'll all turn out all right. Faith can be inspiring in ways that are quite remarkable, even to the non-believer. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Mark Inglis, but he lost both of his legs from the knee down in a mountaineering accident. And the doctors didn't even have to bother telling him he'd never climb a mountain again. Only he didn't see it that way. And he got artificial legs strapped on, and he trained and trained, and this is him, back on top of Mount Everest, a mountain that relatively few people in the world have ever attempted, let alone successfully climbed. That is certainly a kind of faith in action. Faith can be self-centered. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay, he had faith in himself like almost nobody else. And he had it both as a Christian and as a Muslim, which kind of underlines how detached faith and religion can be. It can also be the basis for quiet determination. I'm sure you all know of Charles Schwab, the founder of Schwab Funds. What you may not know, I didn't until fairly recently, is that he is dyslexic. And he was dyslexic before there was a diagnosis for it. So he struggled his way through high school and got to college and found that he was hitting a wall everywhere because he could not read or write effectively. But through sheer determination and calling on the help of a lot of other people, he managed to get through it and to not only succeed in college, but succeed in founding a financial services empire. And today he contributes a lot to literacy causes, which is something close to my heart. So if you want to know about faith, talk to Chuck. Finally, faith can certainly be abstract. Now these are symbols of faith in our country. But when we talk about faith in our country, if we try to explain it, we usually talk about it in terms of abstract ideals, in terms of freedom, our American way of life. Those are quite abstract things. So the word faith encircles a wide variety of concepts and attributes. And I struggled, along with defining religion, to come to a definition of faith. But finally, after a lot of work, this is what I came to, and I wonder if it'll work for you. It seems to me that faith is the unshakable belief that, come what may, some greater good will result in the end. And you'll notice that this certainly can accommodate a religious interpretation. It can also accommodate tragedy. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go just fine. It suggests, though, that in the end, things will turn out for the better. Some greater good will occur. Along the way, we may suffer tragedy and setbacks. Does that make sense to you? Does that distinction work? Okay, good. So, who has faith? Well, I would suggest to you that anyone who can look into the future with hope is a person of faith. And that certainly broadens the scope quite a lot. But let's get specific and give credit where it's due. Certainly, mainstream and liberal Christians have faith, at least many of them do. As do moderate Muslims. And in case any of you have any doubts, let me testify from personal experience. I work with several moderate Muslims, and they're absolutely wonderful people. They're not a figment of liberal media. Even transhumanists have faith. I don't know how many of you are familiar with transhumanists and their idea of the singularity, but these are people, broadly speaking, who believe that we are evolving toward becoming a technological society in which we actually merge with our technology. The prophet of this movement, if you will, is Ray Kurzweil, himself an inventor of many electronic devices. And he and his followers have dubbed the moment when machines and people come together on an equal level of intelligence as the singularity. After that, they predict life will change dramatically. Well, I'm somewhat sympathetic to those ideas, but I don't get excited about them the way that they do. And I have to backpedal and say, certainly, many old-time religionists have faith. They look forward to a glorious future, for some in paradise. This is a pretty nice vision for old guys like me. Maybe not so much for the young virgins who are also pictured there, but there are many different ideas about what the greater good that finally results might be, and they encompass many religious and secular points of view. But hold on a sec. Who's right? What if one of these is right and the others are wrong? That could make a great difference. So we have to ask ourselves, does God rule the world? In particular, does the God of the Bible, the God that Jews and Christians worship, or if you're expansive, the God that Jews, Muslims, and Christians all worship, does that God rule the world? Or is it possibly Odin, the chief of the Norse gods, the one-eyed chief of the north? Or perhaps even Shiva. I am sorry, if that clicker was working, I'd much rather be over here and letting you see. Shiva, about whom the Bhagavad Gita says, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Is the quotation familiar to anybody? Does it ring a bell? Mike, anybody else? Robert Oppenheimer is known as the father of the atom bomb, who led the Manhattan Project. After the first successful test of the atom bomb at Trinity, most everybody there was thrilled they'd succeeded. But Oppenheimer was a reflective, philosophical man, and he went back to something he'd read in college, the Bhagavad Gita, and looked up Shiva and repeated those words, thinking, oh my God, what have we done? Well, to ask if God exists in any of these forms is really a senseless question unless you define him or her. You simply can't answer the question if you don't give some sort of definition. And what I want to hone in on here is the question of whether traditional theism's view of God is justified. Does reason and evidence support the claims of traditional theism? And what are those? Well, in some they are that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, a benevolent God. And a way of summing that up is to say that God is supremely perfect, that any kind of virtue that exists, God has to an infinite degree. This is the commonly held view among several religions. I'm speaking really here of the Western religions, what are called the people of the book. And I'm just going to focus on that one question for now. We certainly should acknowledge that there are other views of God both among contemporary religionists and in other religious traditions. But this is the big one. This is the one that's shared by the largest number of religious believers in the world. And so it's consequential for reasons I mentioned earlier on. That those traditional religious forces are powerful movers in our world today. So, does it make sense to say that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good? Well, somebody from a science background, I like this, because this is a claim we can test. And in fact, we have. And I will suggest to you that traditional theism fails because the key arguments for theism have been decisively refuted, and the key argument against theism has been validated. Let me share these with you real quickly. There are two key arguments for theism, for the traditional view of God. The first one in the Christian tradition comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's the argument from necessity, also known as the cosmological argument. And this comes down to set of propositions and a conclusion, like a good philosophical argument should. It argues everything we observe has a cause. So to explain the existence of things, we must avoid an infinite regress of causes. If we simply have an infinite chain of causes going back as far as the eye can see and beyond, then explanation is hopeless. But if there was a first cause, then it must be an uncaused cause. And only God could be that uncaused cause. Okay. That's a summary of the argument from necessity. There are some variations on it, and I've looked at them, and if we have time in discussion, I'd be glad to talk about them. But I think that's a fair summary of it. However, it fails. It fails for at least two reasons. First, when Thomas Aquinas was writing, and before him, many centuries before him, Aristotle, it's true, everything you could observe seemed to have a cause. But we now observe things in nature that do not have a cause, at least not a direct cause. And quantum mechanics is where this is principally found. We have a phenomenon called spontaneous emission. An electron will drop from one orbit down to another and emit a photon. Or an atom periodically will split and emit particles. These have been studied very, very carefully. And there are two things that we can say for sure. One is that certain kinds of reactions, like radioactive decay, can be predicted in quantity with exquisite precision. I mean, down to 5 decimal places. You can predict how many alpha particles are going to be ejected by this stuff. But the other important thing here is that it is impossible to predict when any one of those atoms will decay. They go off at random. These are truly random events. So it's not true to say that everything that happens for a cause. Now, science has abstracted from that certain laws of nature, and you could say the laws of nature are the reason why these things happen, and that's fine. But you cannot tie the law to any particular event. It will not predict one event. It can only predict the statistical aggregate of events. Then the other reason that that argument from necessity fails is that there's no necessity for an uncaused cause to be God. In fact, we now have from science a fairly elaborate alternative scenario, which is the multiverse, in which bubble universes, and we happen to occupy one, are popped out of quantum foam at random. And each one has a different set of parameters, a different set of laws. And it's sort of like laying out cards. If you lay out hands of cards an infinite number of times, you will get a royal flush. It'll take a long time, but you'll get it. In fact, you can lay out all 52 cards, and eventually you'll get them in perfect order, just at random. It'll take an incredibly long time to do that, but the multiverse theory suggests that there is an infinite amount of time and space in which to tinker around. So there is no necessity for the uncaused cause to be God. Now, there's another major argument for God, and this is the most popular one according to polls. People in America, at least, when they're asked why they believe in God, if they do, they usually say, because how else can you explain everything here? And then somebody says evolution, and they say, oh, don't tell me everything came about by chance. Which unfortunately is a testimony to what a poor job we do of teaching science in school, because evolution is certainly not a theory that suggests that everything came about by chance. But that's another talk that I give. So the argument from design was written down in its most compelling form by Reverend William Paley about 3-4 centuries ago. And he said, suppose I was walking along a beach and I came across a rock. I would just figure that's a rock, nothing special about it. But what if I came across a pocket watch, which particularly in those days, these were the 1700s, was a really valuable, intricate object. He would say, I could look at that and I could be sure that there was a watchmaker. Watches don't just happen. So he argued that order doesn't spontaneously arise in nature from disorder. Therefore, if you find something that looks designed, it implies a designer. Appearance of design is evidence of a designer. Now, living things appear to be designed. No arguing with that. Therefore, there is a designer who was God. That's an argument that many people find very compelling. There are just two problems with it. First, we do observe spontaneous order to arise in nature. I bet every one of you has observed it, at least had the opportunity to. Thanks to the Hubble telescope, we've seen images of stars, which are ordered bodies, forming out of amorphous bodies of gas. Living here in Lincoln, we've all seen, or had the opportunity to see, snowflakes. They arise spontaneously from droplets of water that are very suddenly frozen. And excitingly, scientists have found that the building blocks of life arise spontaneously under some conditions. RNA, which is thought to be a precursor to DNA, and which is in every one of our bodies, it's the messenger between the center of our cells and the exteriors. RNA spontaneously forms under some very remarkable conditions. The other reason is much like the first one. If there is a designer, there's no necessity for that designer to be God. In William Paley's day, and Paley, by the way, was a minister, nobody would have thought of anything else. If it wasn't X, it would have to be Y, and Y would be God. But we have a much broader cultural outlook now, and we can imagine many alternative scenarios for a designer who might have been responsible for the universe as we see it. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in this talk, but please keep it in mind. However, I think there are some even more fundamental reasons why these arguments fail. And it's one that I call the argument from crummy design. If you want to claim that the world was designed, I say, okay, maybe you could make that case. But if you want to make the claim that the traditional theistic God made the world, you have a big problem. because the world is not well designed. Sure, it's accommodating because we're here, but there's no getting around the fact that the world is filled with disasters, disease, and all kinds of things that are poorly designed. In our own bodies, our backs are not very well designed. Our eyes are much more poorly designed than the eyes of some other creatures on Earth. And if you extend outwards from us, there are all kinds of instances of poor design. Earthquakes, volcanoes. This is no way to run a hospitality industry. If the Earth was created for us to live on, you have to wonder why it was so shoddily constructed. But I think beyond that, perhaps the key piece of evidence that sinks the argument from design by a supreme being is the habit of big chunks of rock and ice screaming into Earth every 30 million years or so and wreaking huge amounts of damage. Now, we know that at least 3 times throughout life's history, major impactors have wiped out more than half of life. We are the benefactors of the most recent occasion, about 65 million years ago, when a major impact happened in the Gulf of Mexico and put the kibosh on the last of the dinosaurs, giving room in the world for mammals to arise. But there are 30 megacraters around the world, indicating impacts that would, if they occurred today, surely doom civilization. That just does not make sense in the context of a world claimed to be designed by a perfect creator. So this leads right into the other big argument against theism, and that is evil. The presence of evil in the world, long before modern science, has troubled people who have attempted to think about theology deeply. St. Thomas Aquinas, who I mentioned before, was one of the first to really express misgivings about the presence of evil in the world. Now, evil is kind of a loaded term, and there are at least 2 distinct kinds of evil. What are called natural evils, natural disasters in modern parlance, and then human-caused evils. It's a lot easier to explain away human-caused evils, but natural evils have to be considered as well. For a long, long time, people thought that lightning, people in many cultures, not just the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, thought that lightning was an expression of God's anger, that God was singling out sinners for punishment with lightning strikes. And then in the mid-1700s, Benjamin Franklin conducted his famous experiment with a kite and string and a key. He was not actually holding the kite string. This is relatively accurate, otherwise he probably would have died. But he determined that lightning is nothing more than common electricity in very sudden and powerful bolts. Well, as a practical genius, Franklin promptly invented the lightning rod. And many places in Boston where he was living at the time immediately adopted it. But many churches resisted, and it was outright banned in Germany for 30 years. And in those 30 years in Germany, some 400 churches were struck by lightning. 120 church personnel died in those lightning strikes, and at least one of them was a priest. Even today, churches are often struck by lightning. Their architecture makes them particularly vulnerable. So churches that reject Franklin's scientific approach to lightning do so at their peril. But human evils as well are often explained in the Christian tradition by saying, well, God made Adam and Eve, he told them what he wanted them to do, they didn't do it, boom, they're suffering the consequences, and so are we. And for some reason that makes sense to people. Does that make sense? If you're talking about a supreme being, first of all, why would a supreme being make creatures with free will and make them defective? I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I have a lot of trouble with temptation. And evidently so did Adam and Eve. I'm made that way. We're all made that way. We can actually explain these things through evolutionary psychology now, but let's go back to the frame of reference. Just philosophically, why would a supreme being set his own creatures up for failure. He had to know. He's all-knowing. This just doesn't make sense. But even if you can rationalize that away, okay, he told them what to do, they screwed up because they're defective. What would an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God do? He'd do just what any responsible manufacturer would do. He'd recall them, fix them, and put them back in place. The story as it's told just doesn't make sense. It's just that we learn it at such an early age, and we become accustomed to it, and we think, oh yeah, that's the way it worked. But if you think it through, it simply does not make sense. So the problem of evil really sinks theism, if nothing else does, in my view. And indeed, all the credible, all the reliable, replicable evidence shows that the world we inhabit operates according to natural laws and random events. There's no moral pattern to disasters. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people, and sometimes vice versa. But interestingly, we also know that the combination of random laws and natural events can be incredibly creative. And that is what evolution is all about. But as I say, that's a talk for another day. So if traditional theism fails, and I think it does, and if science succeeds in explaining the world around us, but not absolutely everything beyond us, where does that leave us? Well, in the view of atheists, it leaves us with materialism. And materialism is reducible to something that looks sort of like a scientific equation. It's laws and chance over matter and energy. It's just simple operations of things that, in the aggregate, add up to more interesting things, including you and me. This might be true. There's no evidence to contradict it. It might be, going back to that multiverse theory, it might be that our structured world arose out of a quantum foam along with an infinite or nearly infinite number of other structured worlds, and ours happens to be the one where we can live. We obviously can't be in a world that won't support life. So here we are. That's known as the anthropic principle. And that might be a valid explanation for why we're here. It might be. But it ain't necessarily so. And this is where I am an agnostic, as I said at the outset. I think that scenario is possibly true. I think it's also possibly true that the universe that we inhabit had an intentional creator. Maybe a creator who hoped that eventually creatures like us would arise. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but first let's get the broad scope of things. The problem with the atheists saying that we've disproved traditional theism, therefore materialism, is exactly the same as the problem of the fundamentalist who says, I disproved evolution, therefore God. It's a fallacy in philosophy. Is anybody familiar with it? Do you know the term? It's the fallacy of the excluded middle. It's mistaking in symbolic terms the proposition, if not A, then B, not A, therefore B. But in this case, we're talking about if not A, then B through Z. There are lots of different possibilities. I've only put down a few here, but what might explain our situation? It might be that God is all-powerful, but not so good. Maybe. Or it might be that God is all good, but not so powerful. Or there might be a creator who's not God at all. Or maybe we're not the focus of the creator. We now know there are lots and lots of planets that could conceivably support life, maybe even life like us. Maybe we're on one of the planets that didn't come up lucky. Or maybe there was a creator who was a natural being, somewhat like ourselves, who made the universe in hopes that we would arise in it, but was unable to make a perfect universe or to communicate with us or to see what happened. I call this proposition natural deism, and that's the one that I'm agnostic about in particular. Although in principle I'm agnostic about the other ones as well. Let's go through these real quickly. So what if God is all-powerful but not good? Well, this cartoon kind of gets at that. The dad explains to the son why bad things happen to good people, because God moves in mysterious ways. But from the outside, this pair of aliens says, why does this simulation work 6% more efficiently? We let bad things happen to good people. I mean, that's just a shift of perspective that's pretty mind-blowing, but it stands for something. It stands for the proposition that if we don't know what's going on, it is possible that the universe had a creator, that the creator is aware of us, but they just don't care. Or, as people sometimes say, there's a hidden higher good. But those are fruitless speculations. They don't allow for any kind of testable prediction. They don't make us feel any better. They don't get us anywhere. So I think we can brush them off for other reasons. What about all good but not all powerful? I bet many of you are aware of this. Harold Kushner, a rabbi whose son was born with progeria, one of the most horrible genetic diseases that there is. It causes a child to go through accelerated aging and just develop wrinkles and all the ailments of old age before his parents' eyes or her parents' eyes, and then shrivel up and die before they're 20. It's just horrible. And it's just the result of the genetic lottery. It happens once in a while, and fortunately not more in a while, but it happened to him, and it caused him to do a deep rethink about his beliefs, and he wrote this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Not if, not why, but when. And in it, he suggests that God is good, but he's not able to save us from tragedies like that. So that is also a possibility, and that one might make us feel better, but again, it's not testable, it doesn't lead anywhere, we can't go anywhere with it. So I'd like to suggest one other, which I mentioned a few moments ago, as natural deism. I think it's possible that life proceeds in a cosmic circle. I think it's possible that life like ours gets to the point in a bubble universe where it knows that things will run down and eventually die, no matter what they do, or it does, or he or she, however you care to characterize it. And I think to myself, well, what if we were in that situation? What would we do? And because we, by and large, are loving parents, or uncles, or grandmas, or cousins, we would try to keep life alive. By and large, we value life. We find goodness in the mere existence of life. If we could possibly find a way to keep the torch of life going, we would do it. And then I think back, well, could that be why we live in this bubble universe that's hospitable to life? Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. I don't know so. I'm agnostic about it. But it's a possibility. And it's a possibility, moreover, that is testable in one sense. If we are able to advance to the point where we can do that, then we will have good reason to look back and think, that's how we got here. And I could explain this at greater length, but I'll just say that if you only have one instance of something, then the best guess about what's going on is that it's typical. It's what usually happens, because the extraordinary happens very rarely. So if we find that eventually, 1,000 centuries from now, when our sun is burned out and we've moved the earth to a safer location and we've spread our civilization to other worlds, but we know that dark energy is tearing the universe apart and that eventually there isn't going to be any usable energy left, if we're able at that point to create another universe bubble, then at that point I think we're going to know that's very likely how we came about. It's called the principle of mediocrity, which is a shame because mediocrity is something that we don't associate with good. But it's like this. If you dug a hole all the way through the earth and came up in China, the first person you met would very likely be a pretty typical Chinese person, right? Because that's what the odds are. You might happen to run into the president of China, but the chances are about 7 billion to 1. No, a little less than that. But anyhow, pretty poor chances. So that's another possibility that I explore in my book. And again, I'm an agnostic about it, but at least I like the idea that it's in principle something we can test. Well, each of these is in its own way plausible, and each is consistent with the evidence. That doesn't mean there's evidence for it, but nothing in those several propositions that I just suggested to you, that God is all-powerful but not so good, or all good but not so powerful, or that there's a natural mother for our universe. None of those is contradicted by what we find. Traditional theism, that's contradicted by what we find. That's why there's a whole industry called apologetics that tries to explain it away. But there's a clear clash between those claims and what we find in the world. Not so with these. We cannot know, at least not for 10 centuries or something. So how can we possibly unite? If we circle all the way back to my opening question, can we unite to overcome religious strife? Well, I sure hope so, and I've given it some thought. Here is what I think might amount to a thread that can unite us, and I welcome your opinions about this in just a couple of moments. It consists of several principles: tolerance, humility, reason, empathy, and determination. I think bringing those together is a set of principles around which people of good faith can unite. That is, people who don't want to blow up the world, who don't want to kill others to make their particular idea of God victorious, people who don't want to shut down other people's pleasures to please their idea of God. Let me just unpack these a little tiny bit, and then I will wrap up. Tolerance, what do I mean by that? Well, tolerance is acknowledging religions for what they really are. As I said earlier, they're cultural interpretations of ultimate reality. That means none of us has the absolute truth, or none of us knows it if we do. And that leads directly into humility. Humility is the acceptance that as human beings we're incapable of grasping the ultimate truth. Reality is too big, too complicated, too mysterious for us. Richard Feynman, who advanced quantum theory more than any other scientist in the second half of the 20th century, and who was an ardent atheist, said nature's imagination is so much greater than our own. And I think he was right. Reason. Reason is absolutely critical for us because it provides the common ground on which we can explore evidence together. If we simply stay in our ideological shells, there is no possibility of coming to some sort of accord other than by force or undue manipulation or simply going our separate ways. And the world's not big enough for us to go our separate ways anymore. Empathy. I don't believe I have to tell you about empathy, but let me just say that compassion gives meaning to our lives beyond our own selfish interests. The ability to experience joy or pain in others and to appreciate other people's journey through life expands our own and gives a greater meaning to what we do. And finally, determination. We cannot, if we hope to move forward as humanity, simply sit on our porches and tend our own private interests. We have to accept the findings of science that tell us our civilization does face grave perils, starting today and intensifying tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. If we can work together, if we accept that life is good, and that means therefore whatever our particular worldview might be, we can all agree that making the world sustainable for life into the future is our common purpose, then I think we can achieve a world civilization that allows for many different religions, many different cultural interpretations of ultimate reality, and yet have a real measure of unity. What would a world like that look like? Well, it might look a little bit like this. Still green and blue with nice fluffy white clouds, a lot of different points of view, just as there are a lot of different languages in the world, many different ways of cooking food. Why not many ways of interpreting what the ultimate order of things is, as long as we can agree on some essential common principles. And that means there's a boundary to tolerance. Tolerance doesn't mean we just accept whatever anybody else says. As I said at the outset, anybody has the right to believe anything. None of us has the right to know everything. And what's more, as a civilization, we have the right to limit people's behavior based on their beliefs if that behavior proves to be antisocial or in other ways undesirable. So, to give you an example, if a neo-Nazi cult wants to go about trying to exterminate what they see as the mud people, we do not have to respect their religious belief to the extent of tolerating their behavior. I could name many other examples, but I think you get my point. Tolerance has boundaries. Reason helps us to set those boundaries, and it's that shared vision of what's ahead for us all that helps us to determine how to marshal reason in service to that. Well, with that, you've been very patient and attentive. Thank you so much. I will wrap it up here and look forward to some discussion with you.
All right, thank you, Clay.